Welcome to Three Distinct Knocks. I'm David Riley, and
I'm Nicholas Harvey.
tonight we have a slightly different presentation that we're doing. So I'd like to introduce our special guest, Nicholas Harvey, who is going to be substituting for a guest and also substituting for our audience. So if you're in the IRC at this point, you can ask questions and Nicholas will feed them to me. But also he's going to be asking his own questions, and hopefully he'll ask the questions you would ask if you were here. Our presentation today is one that I've done before for a couple of lodges on Masonic morality. And I don't really have a rant the way we have been doing it previously, because I think this might take a little more time than our usual interview. But I do want to start with a tiny rant, a micro rant, as it were, which is to say, I think one of the mistakes that we make about Masonic education is that we define it too narrowly. I think too often we reach for the thing that we've seen done for Masonic education, like talking about the importance of George Washington. But did you know he was a Mason, Nick?
No, had no idea.
But we ignore the other topics that are legitimately part of Masonic education, which can be quite wide-ranging. And instead, we focus very narrowly on our history or on specific aspects of our ritual, instead of thinking about the bigger meaning, the bigger questions that the craft is designed to encourage men to ask and to find answers to. So tonight we're going to be talking about ethics, morality, both from a general philosophical point of view and from a very specifically Masonic point of view. And I think that's a legitimate topic for a Masonic discussion. And so I would encourage all of you to think about Masonic education, perhaps in a wider frame than you have before. So that's the micro rant. Without further ado, let's start. For those of you who are used to listening to the podcast, audio only, I'm going to try to remember that that's an issue for you, and try to provide enough verbal description that you'll get the general idea. But I will tell you now that it may be easier if you also watch the video of the podcast, because I am using a PowerPoint presentation, and I think some of the slides help provide a better context for what we're talking about than I'll be able to do verbally. But you should be able to get along if you can't. So what we're going to be doing is exploring Masonic morality using Trolleyology, which is a specific question or set of questions in ethics to discover what is unique in Masonic moral teaching. Nick, Freemasonry is
a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols.
Right. So often the original quote is a peculiar system of morality, but it means peculiar in the sense of specific, right? So if Freemasonry is a system of morality, then I think that we have to ask ourselves, how does Freemasonry differ in its morality from the morality of general culture? How is it peculiar? How is it unique? How does it compare with other systems of ethics? Trolleyology is a specific, arises from a specific question that a philosopher named Philippa Foot developed in 1967. She first introduced the trolley problem in a very simple format, and then both she and other ethicists have since then expanded to have a whole different set of questions, many of which feature trolleys running down tracks. And as you'll see, this is a fairly bloody presentation. People are pretty much always in danger of dying. But these questions are thought problems designed to force you to choose and explain why you choose a particular action. It's important to remember that these problems are problems in ethics. They're not problems in engineering or in creative problem solving. So you really do have to limit yourself to the world of the problem. You're not allowed to tinker with the choices that are presented. The choices that are presented are the point of the problem. So don't go looking for outside solutions. Explore the solutions inside the problem, which are designed to reveal your ethical thinking. So this is an early version of the trolley problem, although it's not the original problem. It's a earlier, slightly better version. There is a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them. You are standing some distance off in the train yard next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, that you notice there is one person tied up on that other set of tracks. You have 2 options. You can do nothing, and the trolley kills 5 people on the main track, or you can pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track, where it will kill 1 person. What's the correct choice?
I think the correct choice would be to kill the 1 person.
Yeah, and I think most people come to that decision. I think the vast majority of us take that approach that, it's more desirable to kill 1 person than to kill 5 people, all other things being equal. So why did this question become so interesting to ethicists and others, actually? You'll see as I continue this presentation. This opened a whole realm of exploration in ethics that hadn't been opened previously. Prior to World War II, relativism became a very popular form of thought around ethics. And moral statements were viewed as the equivalent to statements of approval or disapproval. This is sometimes called the boo hooray school of morals, because they said that saying that something was right was no more than saying, hooray, I like that. And saying something was wrong was no more than saying, boo, I don't like that. That there was no objective right or wrong. It was just sort of a question of aesthetics. I think Foote's experience during the Blitz in World War II, she specifically writes about being a graduate student and she and her roommate sheltering in the bathtub as London was bombed. And her experience of seeing what happened in World War II and the Holocaust as that unfolded and became public knowledge, really caused her to object strongly to the moral relativism. And she wanted to derive a principle for moral intuition. That is to say that she thought that moral intuition was something that almost all people had, barring significant mental illness or whatever, that everybody had an interior understanding of right and wrong. And that from that moral intuition, you could derive rules that would be broadly agreed upon. There are 2 major schools of ethics and philosophy. And I'm going to oversimplify massively, both in saying that there's 2 major schools and in defining and talking about these 2 major schools. But oversimplification is necessary if I'm going to do this presentation in the time we have allotted and not take 2 semesters for it. So if you want to explore them more, I encourage you to do so. It's interesting stuff. One of the schools is called Utilitarianism, or sometimes called, which is a subset of a school of ethics called consequentialism, versus rights-based or deontological ethics. And we'll talk about what those mean. Utilitarianism, the philosopher best known and most associated with utilitarianism is far and away Jeremy Bentham. Bentham is arguably the most influential philosopher in the Western modern age. It is arguable that the reason that governments, especially the government of England, has any notion that they have a duty to eliminate human misery is because of Jeremy Bentham. You know, we've all seen movies depicting, you know, Jack the Ripper age London and how poor people were and how the government didn't do anything to help them. In fact, it had a tendency to make things worse. Bentham's philosophy revolutionized the way the government thought about the poor, the ill, the disabled, the helpless, the hungry, the orphaned. You know, instead of having orphans running on the street, they started setting up orphanages and institutions to help these kids. That was a direct result of Jeremy Bentham's the impact of his philosophy on British thought and consequentially on Western society. In fact, there was a point at which Jeremy Bentham was so often quoted in the House of Commons in England that when a quote wasn't otherwise attributed in the speech, it was just automatically assumed to be a quote from Jeremy Bentham because that was probably a safe bet. So utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. That is, it teaches that actions are morally neutral. What matters is the consequences of those actions. And he says that action is right, which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, he's not talking about happiness as, you know, momentary satisfaction. He's talking about happiness in the deepest, most philosophical sense, real, genuine happiness. That is to say, that he would say if you could have a unit of happiness, hedon, let's say, and you could add up all the hedons that would be produced by doing action A, and all the hedons that would be produced by taking action B, and those were your two choices, you should always take the action that produces the most hedons. So in our trolley example, Bentham would argue very strongly for pulling that lever and saving the 5 people and killing only the 1, because you're making 5 people very happy, although you're making 1 extremely unhappy, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's the benefit of the majority.
Right. It's the greatest good for the greatest number, as Spock would say in Star Trek. Yeah. So, in contrast to utilitarianism, we have deontological ethics. And Immanuel Kant is probably the most representative philosopher for deontological ethics, although he's harder to understand than Bentham, but I'll do my best. He's probably the most influential metaphysician of the modern era, which is interesting because I think he wanted to be an ethicist, but his idea was that there's something called the categorical imperative, which is the objective right that exists in the universe. It is the right action. The categorical imperative always tells you what's right. But he said the categorical imperative is ineffable. That is, it can't be expressed in words. It exists, you can test against it, but it can't be expressed in words. But there are a couple of ways that he suggested that you can approximate the categorical imperative and test to see if the action you're about to take is aligned with it. And so he said the first one is that people must always be treated as ends and never as a means to an end alone. So in short, you shouldn't use people. He also said that you should be able to universalize your action. That is to say that any action that you would take, you should be able to wish that all people in all circumstances at all times should take that action. And that if, when you thought about that, your action becomes logically inconsistent, then that action is wrong. The usual example for that is telling a lie. So if everybody lied all the time, in every circumstance, to every person they spoke to, lying would have no value, right?
Right.
So everyone would know, well, you're lying. So
Right.
he's much more concerned with the morality of your action than with the consequences of your action, with the rights of the people involved than the utility of what you're doing. So in order to make things slightly more complicated, there's an idea called the doctrine of double effect. And I'm introducing this only because a version of this, as we look at the various um, examples of the trolley problem, people kind of organically come up with this idea. And I think having it laid out in a very formal way is helpful. So the doctrine of double effect has really been explored by a lot of Roman Catholic ethicists. So I'm using the New Catholic Encyclopedia example of the doctrine of double effect, but it's used elsewhere, and in fact has been uh, essential in thinking about ethical issues. So the idea is that you can do something which would otherwise be wrong if what you're doing is accomplishing another end. You don't mean for the wrong action. You're not doing the wrong action for the sake of the wrongness, but because it's necessary in order to accomplish some other good. So the first thing is that the act itself must be morally good or at least indifferent. That is to say, you have to have a moral good as the end. The agent may not positively will the bad effect, but may permit it. If he could attain the good effect without the bad effect, he should do so. The bad effect is sometimes said to be indirectly voluntary. That is, you're allowing the bad thing to happen, even though you don't really want the bad thing to happen. And I'll give a concrete example of this that'll make it clearer in a minute. The good effect must flow from the action at least as immediately, in the order of causality, though not necessarily in the order of time, as the bad effect. In other words, the good effect must be produced directly by the action, not by the bad effect. Otherwise, the agent would be using a bad means to attain a good end, which under this idea is never allowed. The good effect must be sufficiently desirable to compensate for the allowing of the bad effect. What does all that mean? Well, the best example that I can give is when my mother had her second stroke and she lost the ability to swallow, and she had half of her body paralyzed, and there was zero chance that any of that was going to recover. By the way, you never think about this, but losing your ability to swallow is really pretty much that's an end of life kind of thing. There's very little that they can do that will extend your life in any sort of productive way once you lose your ability to swallow. So, in order to help her deal with any discomfort or pain she was experiencing, they gave her fairly strong doses of morphine. Now, the morphine almost undoubtedly shortened my mother's life, no question. But it also relieved her pain. The relieving of her pain was a sufficiently good and desirable outcome that the shortening of her life, which was already ending, which would be considered a bad effect by doctors ordinarily, was mitigated by that. And so that's the doctrine of double effect. They knew they were giving my mother medicine that was shortening her life. But in order to make her more comfortable, and her life was ending anyway, it was allowable under the doctrine of double effect. Are you with me?
Yes. I have no idea how you're going to tie this into masonry.
Yeah, well, if it's a system of morality, then we have to think about what morality Masons espouse. So we'll get to that in just. Actually, here's the question: does the fraternity make a difference in our moral thinking? Okay. So let's look at the trolley problem again. There's a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley's headed straight for them. You're standing some distance off in the train yard next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice there's one person tied up on the other track. You have 2 options: do nothing, and the trolley kills 5 people on the main track; pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill 1 person. Now, we previously agreed that most people, Nicholas included, would choose to pull the lever, to take an action and allow 1 person to die in order to save 5. Sort of consider yourself 4 up in the game, right?
Right.
So assume you decided to pull the lever and save the 5 people. Just as you reach for it, you realize that you know that one guy on the other track from Lodge. You don't know any of the people in the group of 5. Does that change your thinking?
Oh, I'm going to get so much hate for this. I'd like to think it doesn't.
Really?
Depends which laws we're talking about.
Yeah, that's probably a truthful answer.
I don't know. What about you? What?
Yeah, I think it's not as easy as people try to make it out. I know lots of people, their gut instinct, especially men, and we'll talk about differences in genders and ethical thinking later on in this presentation, but I think a lot of men don't want it to make a difference. But I think there's an argument that it should, and I'll present that argument in the form of another sort of trolleyology problem. This one that doesn't actually involve a trolley. But let's say there's 2 houses, okay? Side by side, identical houses, everything about them is the same. Mm-hmm. Both houses are on fire. From the second story of both houses, a child is screaming for help.
Oh my goodness.
You are the only person who sees these houses on fire, and you have time to rescue only one of the children. While you're rescuing one of them, the other one is absolutely certain to burn to death, okay? One of the children you've never seen before. The other child, well, that's your child. Which child do you rescue?
Well, of course, I'd save my child.
How's that different from this problem? Is it because it's 5 people and not 1 person? Okay, it's 5 children and you had 5 kids. Thank you, Jessica. You have 5 kids, 5 of your kids, and 5, or you're 1 kid and 5 kids in the other house. Let's do it that way. So there's 5 kids you don't know and 1 of your kid. Still rescuing your kid? See, guys want to hesitate on this, and I think that that's wrong. I think the answer is yes. I have an absolute duty to rescue my family, right?
Yeah.
I would like to rescue the strangers too. I'm not saying I don't want to save them. I'm just saying I have a duty to my kid that overrides my duty to the stranger, right?
Sure. I mean, yeah.
It's not very comfortable to think about it that way, is it?
No.
Yeah, just wait, it gets worse.
This is so hard.
So this is another example of a problem, but it's sort of flipping it on its head, and we'll see how you react to this. A doctor is desperate to help 5 of his patients who will otherwise soon die. 2 need partial lung transplants, 2 need kidney transplants, and 1 needs a heart transplant. As the doctor is treating a completely unrelated motorcycle accident victim, he discovers that the motorcycle accident victim is a perfect match for all of his other patients. The victim would otherwise make a full recovery eventually, but if the doctor kills him right now, the organs can be harvested and save 5 lives. Should the doctor kill the motorcyclist?
I would say no. If the motorcyclist was terminal, if he was going to die, then say absolutely cut that cord quick. But I don't think you should. If you had a choice, I don't think you should be responsible for taking a life. See, in the train example, in the trolley or whatever,
right?
It's not it is my choice, but it's not my doing. It's not, I didn't cause this. This is going to happen.
The lever.
Yes, but if I wasn't there, they would still, one of those groups would die.
Yeah, as in this case.
Yes, but
5 patients are going to die if he doesn't kill that motorcyclist.
But therein lies the problem. He kills the motorcyclist.
And you kill the guy on the other track.
I actually don't think that, though. I think if the 5 people are on track A and the one person is on track B and the train was going to go track A no matter who was standing there, then by me diverting it, it's not my cause, if that makes sense.
You killed one guy to save 5. That's exactly what the doctor is doing here.
I saved 5 people by diverting those tracks.
Yeah, you see, the distinction is how the casting of the problem changes how you think about it, right?
Right.
And you're not really sure why it feels different.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not either, actually. But there's definitely a difference in the intuition around this. We've suddenly switched from that utilitarian mode of thinking about, the greater good for the greater number, to suddenly thinking about a rights-based model. Does the doctor have the right to take a life to save 5 lives? All of a sudden, we've switched modes from Bentham to Kant, and we're not sure where that happened or why. But it does. And it happens, just so you don't feel like you're the only one, it happens to almost everyone who thinks about this. Yeah, we talked about that. So what have you learned in Freemasonry that helps you make a distinction between these 2 problems and that informs your approach to them? Is there anything you can think of in Freemasonry that helps you reason through this? Yeah, that's the answer I didn't lodge as right.
Yeah. In my brain, I'm running through every single one of the 6 million degrees I've ever taken. And I was like, no, didn't talk about it in that one. Well, I slept through that one. Maybe it was in there.
So let's see what we can figure out. But before we go there, let's look at a different version of the trolley problem that I think is more like the doctor problem. It's called the fat man. I don't make these up, so it's not my fault. It's called the fat man. As before, a trolley is hurtling down a track towards 5 people. You're on a bridge under which it will soon pass, and you can stop it by putting something very heavy in front of it. As it happens, there's a fat man, a very fat man, right next to you. Your only way to stop the trolley is to push him over the bridge and onto the track, killing him to save 5. Should you proceed?
My answer would be no. My answer would be no, because just like the motorcycle problem, I shouldn't kill somebody.
But you're perfectly willing to pull that lever.
Yeah, but those people are going to die anyway.
5 people are going to die here if you don't push the fat man off the bridge.
Oh, I had a really good quote from Ravi Zacharias that would fit here, but I can't think of it right now. Come on, Ravi, there's a fat man I got to push, please.
So as you quickly try to decide what to do, you realize that one of the people on the track is the widow of a brother master mason. Does that change your thinking?
No.
She's yelling, "Help me, help me."
No, you can't take a life to. I don't believe, my personal opinion is you shouldn't take a life to save the life. Unless that life was, I mean, on the short list anyway.
Yeah, I think the only difference between the fat man problem and the first trolley problem is that you have to touch the fat man, you have to push him. And the trolley problem, you have the intervening mechanics. But you're doing the exact same thing. You're pulling a lever and pushing the fat man off a bridge, in essence. You know, I think the distinction is an emotional rather than an intellectual one. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying I don't think objectively I can't figure out why they're different. I have the same response. I object to pushing somebody, but pulling a lever seems less personal, right?
Yeah.
So here's a real life trolley problem. And this is actually completely true. And it just so happens that it stars a member of the fraternity. So, you know, Winston Churchill, like George Washington, was a Mason.
Yeah.
And during World War II, there were these 3 spies in London who the Nazis thought were spying for them. But what they didn't know is that all 3 of them had independently gone to the British authorities and said, look, we're supposed to be spying for Germany, but we're not going to do that. But we'll do whatever you tell us to do. We don't want to be spies for Germany. And what the British told them is, we'll tell you what to say to them, but keep the line open so that you can give them the reports we tell you to send them. So they were double agents, right? And what they were supposed to be reporting to Germany was the effect of the German rocket attacks on London. You'll remember that the Blitz started with rocket attacks, and these rockets weren't terribly accurate. So after each attack, what Germany wanted to know was, how was our targeting? Did we hit where we wanted to hit, or do we need to adjust our aim so that we can be more accurate? And the German attack was fairly consistently off a bit in that they tended to land further north than they intended to in London. And Churchill made the decision that the spies should tell Germany that their attacks were dead on or even slightly to the south of where they wanted to go, in order to keep them bombing a more northern part of London, which was less heavily populated and had targets that were had fewer targets of cultural, governmental, and military importance. So he was choosing which group of people would die, which group of people would have their homes destroyed, which group of people. And his justification was that the further north he could drive those attacks, the lower the population was, that if central London was getting bombed, there were more people there. But that's a real life trolley problem where he really had to choose. And I think this is a choice that world leaders make on a regular basis. That the choice isn't should people die. The choice becomes which group of people die, right? Because too often it's about resource allocation or how you respond to an event that, you know, it will kill this group of people or this group of people, and you're desperately trying to minimize the damage rather than to achieve some good, which is what Churchill did in this case, right? But that's a real life example of the trolley problem. So if you think these problems are too artificial, I'll just point you to this as an example of perhaps not as artificial as we would like them to be. There's a professor at Harvard University named Joshua Green, And he wrote a book called Tribal, which I recommend for completely other reasons. But he has presented these kinds of thought experiments to individuals while they were in a functional MRI so that their brain activity could be observed while they consider the problems. So a functional MRI can actually show which part of the brains are active while you're in the MRI. So it's like a video of your brain activity, right? In response to both cases, the two different sorts of trolley problems, the one that elicits a utilitarian response and the one that elicits a deontological response, we have the explicit thought that it would be better to save more lives. This response is a more controlled response that depends on the prefrontal control network, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But in response to the footbridge case, most people have a strong negative emotional response to the proposed action of pushing the man off the bridge. Our research has identified features of this action that make it emotionally salient and has characterized the neural pathways through which this emotional response operates. I think that's fascinating. That there's actually a difference in how your brain processes the information when you're talking about touching someone to push them off the bridge versus pulling a lever. He says, and I think this is absolutely key, and I agree with him 100% on this. I do not believe that science can by itself tell us what's right or wrong, but I believe that scientific self-knowledge can help us make progress on distinctively modern moral problems, ones that our brains were not designed to solve. To make good moral decisions, it helps to understand the tools we bring to the job. I think that's really important because when you hear of a scientist studying moral problem solving, there's a desire on our part for science to discover the objective reality of morality. And he's saying that's not going to happen. But what science can provide us is a look at how our brains work and what tools we bring to the job. And just like I think knowing that can help us make better moral decisions, knowing how our brains are working, I also think that it helps us to practice these kinds of things, to have thought through moral dilemmas in an environment where they're harmless, so that when we're interacting in the real world and a moral dilemma presents itself to us, we have experience with sorting out what the elements of it are and mature understanding of our reactions to the problem and how they might be tricking us, so to speak. Gender and the trolley problem. Now, this is where we start to get into how the fraternity ties into all this. When invited to ask questions about the scenarios, men tend to ask objective or problem-solving questions. Women tend to ask about relationships to and among the people in the problem. So a man will ask, well, can I pull the lever halfway and send the trolley halfway in between them? Whereas women will ask, well, do I know any of the people? Is it a family that's on the track, or is it 5 strangers who are on the track?
Oh.
Does Freemasonry, by placing us in greater relationship, seek to change the nature of our moral decision making? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think one of the great purposes of the fraternity, and one of the reasons that it's described as a system of morality, is because by putting us into a relationship with one another, it wants us to begin to think about the relational understanding of moral circumstances that men tend to ignore, that women often focus on. I think it's one of the reasons that Freemasonry is particularly suited to men and not to women, is because it's trying to rectify or at least support a deficit in moral reasoning that is common among men. So how does Masonic morality differ from morality in the dominant culture? Can you think of a way?
Let's hear it. Yeah.
Well, one example is secrecy versus transparency. I mean, I think that's the most obvious one in the age of the Kardashians.
Mm.
You know, I do not understand why people think secrecy or privacy is a bad thing. But then I look at our TVs and the reality shows and what people choose to put out in public about themselves. And I realize all of a sudden, yeah, of course they think secrecy is nefarious. Because they think that the only thing that you don't want to share with the entire world is something shameful. And geez, look at the Kardashians. They share things that I find shameful on their behalf. So I think that that's one way Freemasonry is different from common culture morality, is that we value privacy. And I think one of the reasons we value privacy is because we want men to be able to go to one another and ask for advice without this topic of that advice becoming fodder for gossip. So we value secrecy. We value the ability of a man to go to a brother and say, look, in private, I'm having this problem. Can you give me your advice? I mean, isn't that the reason we don't seek advice from other people, is because we're afraid that they're going to go and blab what we say to everybody else?
We're afraid they're going to go blab. And I think we're afraid that they're going to judge us.
Yeah. So if you have a man that you have trust with and relationship with, and he knows you to be a person trying to be good, and you know that he's not going to babble your business to the world, then you're more likely to go to him for advice, right?
Right.
And that's one way we help good men become better. Tolerance versus intolerance. I think dominant culture is deeply intolerant. You know, we divide ourselves into these silos where if you agree with me, if you're exactly like me, you're a good person. And if you differ even a whit, you're a horrible person. I always think of that joke by Emo Phillips about, you know, I will tell the briefest possible version of it. He comes to a bridge, and there's a man standing on the bridge about to jump off, and Emo Phillips says, wait, don't jump off, don't jump off. And the man says, why shouldn't I? And Emo says, well, are you a person of faith? And the man says, I am. And Emo says, well, are you a Christian, Jewish, Muslim? And the man says, well, I'm a Christian. And Emo says, so am I. What franchise? And the man says, well, I'm a Baptist. And Emo says, so am I. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist? And the man says, Northern Baptist. And Emo says, so am I. Northern Baptist Convention of 1967 or Northern Baptist Convention of 1988? And the man says, Northern Baptist Convention of 1988. And Emo says, heretic, die, and pushes him off the bridge. Right? And I mean, that's funny because it's so ridiculous, but it really is how a lot of us behave. And Freemasonry gives us a chance. I've always said Freemasonry gives us a chance to discover that a man is a good person before we discover what a horrible man he is. You know, we discover there's a guy who's a member of my Mother Lodge who I absolutely adore. And we don't share much in common theologically. We don't share anything in common, I think, politically. But he's a deeply good human being, and we love each other.
Yeah.
And have tremendous respect for him. And I can't imagine any other circumstance in which I would have met him and developed the respect and affection I have for him. And I think if every active Mason stops and thinks for a bit, if he's a member of a good, growing, and active lodge, that's going to be true for all of us, right?
Right.
And I can think of numerous brothers that I really like, who I would just, you know, I, I read their political Facebook posts and I grit my teeth, and I'm sure they're doing the same for me. So, yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah,
I think I think the lodge, I think that's one of the best attributes that our fraternity has, is that we sit in lodge with people that are so different. And I think to a point we sit in lodge with people who have looked in the mirror and said, I didn't work on my ashlar today. I really did a bad job. And then they sit in lodge and then they're like, okay, I'm going to try to do a little bit better. One story I have is when a guy was doing a part of one of the degrees, and as usual, I would wager that a majority of the guys just say the words, but there are some people who act them out or whatever. And this was one of the guys who just say the words, and it was fine. He said all the words correct and all that, and he got to a really beautiful part, and he just started tearing up, and he just started crying, like right there, and we were like, okay. And later on, after the degree and after the candidate was out and all that stuff, and he had no idea, he was like, never before has those words meant so much to me than they did while I was speaking them, because of what I'm going through in my life right now.
yeah. I think frequently the ritual, uh, the definition of Freemasonry that you gave at the beginning says that it's veiled in allegory. Well, the profane don't get to see the allegory. So the people that it's veiled from are the initiates, they're the Masons. It's veiled from us by allegory. And I think the ritual hides from us until we suddenly push aside that veil and we see it. And the circumstances of our lives make us look at it in a different way, and suddenly we see it. And we we didn't hear it before. We heard the ritual a thousand times, but this time we hear it. And all of a sudden it's like a thunderbolt hit you, and it you know you will never hear that line again the same way. It happens to me, most often it happens to me. I i will see the candidate have a reaction, and I'll think about why the candidate is having a reaction. And yeah, I don't know if my conclusions about why the candidate is reacting to that particular line are accurate or not, but all of a sudden I'll have a realization about what is being said, and that the line will strike me in a way that it never has before, and I never hear it the same way again. It's really amazing.
Yeah.
Really amazing. Um, Another difference in Freemasonry versus dominant Western, particularly American culture, is that Freemasonry is communitarian versus individualistic. That is to say, in Freemasonry, one of the overriding values is the harmony of the lodge. And I have told many young Masons this, and I've had mixed success in making the idea clear to them. But in Freemasonry, your argument matters less, the value of your argument in a particular circumstance matters less than whether or not you're being a jerk about it. In any given disagreement in a lodge, the first guy to be a jerk is going to lose, because Masons are taught to value harmony over everything else. The harmony of the lodge matters more. So that's true with members applying, and we should remember this. And it can be, it can be a lesson that can be really hard to learn. If you have to learn it the hard way, it can be devastating. But even the most qualified candidate in all other respects should not be allowed to join your lodge if he's going to be disruptive to the harmony of your lodge. And sometimes that means sending him to another lodge and saying, you know, you're not a good fit for here, but maybe over there. And sometimes it means telling him the fraternity isn't for him, even though he's in all other respects a good guy.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I can think of a particular instance in my own history where, you know, it's so easy to see it in retrospect. Somebody who really became disruptive to the harmony of a lodge was brought in, and you know, I voted on him, and I didn't have concerns at the time. But if I would have thought it, like if I would have known what I know now, then I would have voted differently. It's a really complicated thing, and it's a hard thing to evaluate over the short course, which is the reason that I think it's important to get to know candidates better than we often allow ourselves to before we let them into the lodge, so that we know whether or not they're going to be a good fit. But Freemasonry values the group over the individual in that sense, in that very limited way. I think Masonic morality, in my opinion, for what it's worth, is deeply informed by the symbol of the lost word. Masons are all very comfortable with the idea of something being substituted for the right thing until we can figure out the right thing, right? That's something that we're taught happened. And so if we think of the lost word as the capital T truth, which I think it could be a symbol for that. Like a lot of symbols, it can be a symbol for a lot of things, but let's explore this particular interpretation of that symbol.
I think before we go on that, I think you have to tell your definition on capital T truth versus lower T.
Yeah, exactly. So capital T truth is absolute truth. It's that objective, independent, absolute T truth. For the religious man, that capital T truth is often invested in divinity, right? So there's a Vedic scholar and teacher named Adi Shankara who lived around 820 AD. Oh, well, he died around 820 AD in India. And the Vedas are the sacred text and philosophical texts of Hinduism. And he was a teacher of a particular school of philosophy that attempted to answer the question. In the Vedas, there's this line that says that Atman is Brahman. And the whole purpose of his school of philosophy is to try to explain what the Vedas mean by this, or a significant part of the purpose of his school of philosophy. And so let's talk about Atman and Brahman. Atman, and oversimplifying again for purposes of getting through this, but Atman is the individual personality soul. So that the thing that makes Nicholas is Atman. And Brahman is the underlying reality of the universe. That in German we would call it the Urstoff of the universe, right? The thing that is the underlying reality of everything. And the Vedas teach that those two things are the same. That's an astonishingly ostentatiously confounding claim, right? How is it that the thing that is Nicholas inside of you is somehow the underlying reality of the universe? That just seems like crazy talk. Well, Shankara, and by the way, shout out to worshipful brother Barudi Kemet Sisavan, who is a Vedic scholar. And the first time he heard me talking about this to candidates, because I incorporate this story into candidate education on the third degree to offer them a sort of different interpretation. He burst out laughing and he was like, I never thought I would hear Shankara brought up in Masonic education. Well, Masonic education can be wide-ranging. That's part of my point today. But Barudi was delighted that somewhere in the universe, Shankara, who's part of his line of teaching, is being taught to Masons. So I share this in honor of my friend and brother Barudi. Shankara developed this idea of a great chain of being. Now, in Western culture, in Western medieval philosophy, there's a great chain of being that goes, the slave to the peasant to the Lord to the king to the Pope to God. And that's a chain of being. But Shankara was more interested not in sort of like levels of power and authority. He was more interested in reality, levels of reality. So he said the most unreal things in the universe are logical impossibilities. Married bachelors, square circles, that kind of thing, right?
Right.
Those are obviously the less real things. Then right above them are things that are illusory reality, he called it. Things that might be true, but are not true. So I'm walking down the road and I see a snake in the road and I'm all afraid of the snake, but I take a couple of more steps and I realize, oh, it's not a snake, it's a rope in the middle of the road. The snake has illusory reality. It could have been true. So it's slightly more real than a logical impossibility, but it's not true. That makes sense, right? That feels right.
Right.
The next level of reality up is what he called common reality. The wood of my desk is hard. Nick, did you just stand up?
It's like Poltov's bell.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? There's an instinct there.
So
Anyway,
for anybody else that's standing, can you please gavel us down, please?
oh, yeah.
Okay.
So the wood of my desk is solid. That's common reality. Above that is scientific and mathematical truth. And the best way to think about that is the wood of my desk in common reality is solid, but science teaches us that in fact, it's made mostly of empty space between the atoms and within the atoms. There's a lot of empty space, and there's more empty space than solid substance.
Right.
It's just that it's very tiny empty space. And that's a scientific reality. And Shankara said at that point, we must either accept that there is an infinite chain of error in the universe, that we will always be to some extent wrong, or at some point, the distance between observer and that which is observed must end so that error no longer occurs. Because he says all the differences in these levels of reality, all the error in them happens because there's a distance between the observer and that which is observed. And so if we collapse that and Atman becomes Brahman, then capital T truth is revealed. Now, you don't have to accept Shankara's end argument. There's lots of reasons that you might not. For example, you might think that there's an infinite chain of error. But the reason I tell this is because it gives us a feel for the idea of absolute capital T truth versus smaller truth, small t truth, right? The petty truth of common reality versus the slightly greater truth of scientific and mathematical reality is a tiny step closer, maybe, to that capital T truth. But that capital T truth is something that's always going to elude us in this life. We just don't have access to capital T truth. What we have is a substitute for it, something that works well enough for now. But we have to be open to the idea that the small truth that we have might be subject to change and might be open to getting a step closer to that capital T truth at some point. And I think that that idea inherently forces you to be tolerant of others. Because I can't say to you, Nick, when we disagree on something, about something that neither of us has capital T truth. I can't say to you, you're wrong and I have to kill you.
Right.
I have to accept that you're on your own journey towards capital T truth. And maybe you're coming at it from a slightly different angle than I am, but maybe we're both going to get there. I have to listen to you with an open heart and an open mind. And I may argue with you. I may try to change your perspective, thinking that maybe I'm a little closer, but I have to be tolerant of you. It promotes charity, because if neither of us are in possession of capital T truth, then that means that neither of us is in a position to judge, and that absolute justice isn't possible in this world. We don't know how much of what we have we hold unjustly, however hard we work for it. And we don't know how much the poverty of another person is their fault or just the action of injustice in the world. So we have to be charitable. It promotes community, because we need someplace to test out our small T truths so that we can see if we're on the right track, and we can have others help guide us along. Maybe people who have thought through this before. I think often being isolated when you're thinking about the big issues can make you go a little weird. Aleister Crowley, I'm thinking of you. And I think it promotes, it even underlines the value of secrecy, because the people who try to tell us, the tyrants and the fanatics who tell us that they're in possession of capital T truth, those are dangerous people. And we have to be very careful of them. And so we hold a brother's secrets so that fanatics and tyrants don't kill our brethren again. And I say again because I have a book on my bookshelf that talks about Costos, who was tortured extensively by the Inquisition in Portugal, for example. Or, I have a book that talks about the Masons who were victims of the Nazis. So it wouldn't be the first time that Freemasons, because of our tolerance and our willingness to listen to others and to be in community with others, have been targeted by fanatics and tyrants. And I think those values all spring from that idea of a substitute truth. And I think that's a uniquely Masonic morality. I don't see that morality as being inherently, like it doesn't share anything in common really with utilitarianism. It doesn't share anything in common with a deontological or rights-based approach. It is a uniquely Masonic view of morality. And it's a humble view of morality that I find really intriguing. Any questions about that? Usually when I drop Shankara on people, they have this sort of glazed eye look by the time I'm done. But I have to say, I've become a huge fan of Shankara over the years. And if you want to read, a lot of his stuff is available in translation. I'll tell you a joke about it. It's a true story, but I think it's a funny one about Shankara. Shankara was at a fair with his disciples, and he was teaching. And at this fair, there were elephants. As there often were in India back then. They were sort of the bulldozers and workhorses of India at the time. And one of the elephants went rogue. Now, a rogue elephant is a scary thing. It is a killing machine that can knock everything in front of it down and stomp you, literally squish you to death. And so everybody's running away from the elephant. And when things calm down and the elephant is brought under control and Shankara and his disciples reassemble, one of his disciples says, Shankara, I'm a little confused. If the elephant is only an illusion, the distance between you and the elephant is an illusion, why did you run? And Shankara said, oh, I only seemed to be running. So there you go. Shankar was also kind of a pragmatic guy in that sense.
Yeah. I think definitely it's a lot more common in Massachusetts for sure than Florida, but I think you're correct with Masonry allows guys from all different backgrounds, all different beliefs, and we don't criticize how what somebody believes, capital T, truth, how they connect to the divine is their own thing. And we don't criticize that. We welcome it. And in my experience, and oddly enough, it's most of the guys from your mother lodge, I don't know. It allows a place for guys to talk about what they believe and talk about why they believe that. And they're not being, again, they're not being judged, they're not being criticized. Maybe they don't talk about it with any of their friends or anyone outside the lodge because they're like, oh, well, they're going to think I'm weird. But I've had some of the greatest conversations that connected me better with the God I believe in was from sitting with guys from your mother lodge, particularly, and listening to what they believe and why. And then it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I believe that, or no, I don't believe that.
Right.
But I think it's a very good place because you connect with a brother on a completely different level.
Yeah. One of the brothers in my mother lodge, shout out to worshipful Brendan Curtis. He and I, for a very long time, we thought that we had very different belief systems. And then slowly over time, as we talked, Brendan came to the realization, to his credit, first. I was slower becoming comfortable with it for a variety of reasons, but we realized that a lot of the difference, perhaps the vast majority of the difference between us, was not what we believed, but the metaphor, the words in which we expressed that belief. And so at the core, we had this commonality. And what got in the way of us understanding that was the way we had been taught to express ourselves was just very different. And I don't think that outside of the relationship of the lodge, where you learn to love someone first, could we have gotten through that difference to get to the point where we realized we had so much really in common. And I think both of us would say, I know it's certainly true for me, and Brendan has said things to me that make me think it's true for him. Both of us were changed by the experience of finding that out. Both of us were changed by the experience of exploring that together. But I don't think that outside of that context of a lodge, it would have been easy for us to do. The initial difference would have just ended the conversation. Oh, well, he's one of those crazy people,
Right.
know? And it would have been, there's a huge difference um, drawn between us in profane society, whether you're you know a Jew or a Christian. You know, you know, society, profane society finds those two very different things, right?
Right.
But then you start looking at the belief systems of the two faiths, and there's not there's so much in common. And when you start focusing on that commonality, and you start focusing on learning the other, it brings what you believe into sharper detail. I never understood English grammar as well as I did after learning a foreign language. And I don't think you ever understand your own beliefs as well until you learn enough about the beliefs of another to really appreciate it. Certainly has made my faith stronger.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree.
Well, isn't that inconvenient for you? How do we continue this argument if you would go and agree? So, Masonic morality, is it utilitarian or deontological? I don't think it's either. I think it's first and foremost, it has a humility to it that I think is completely at odds with dominant culture. You know, there is a humbleness in Masonic morality that just flies in the face of everything on our televisions, everything in modern culture. Um, it's just absolutely not the way we think in the profane world. The profane world's idea is so radically different that I think it's almost hard to see Masonic morality for what it is initially. And secondly, I think it is attempting to make us think more about relationships. There's a reason, we invented fraternity. And yes, there were religious organizations and such, depending on when you believe, when you want to draw the line, when it became Freemasonry as opposed to being something else. There were religious organizations prior to that that called each other brother,
Right.
or whatever. But Freemasonry invented fraternity, and we chose the word brother as the title for one another. And it is the single most important title in the fraternity. It's the only, it is the default title when you're not sure what to call the guy, you call him brother, right? We have 10,000 billion titles in the fraternity, and brother is the only one that is universally accepted and that every guy will answer to.
Sure.
And I think that is because we chose the title of relationship that is closest to being equal. That is, it's as intimate a tie as you can have and be equal to another man. And I think it's trying to force us to think about our relationships with all men, with all humans, all people, but to think of them in a more relational fashion, and to think of our morality in a more relational way. So that when we're put inside a functional MRI and given moral dilemmas,
Yeah.
think both about the practical problem solving and the relationships in the story to give us a more balanced morality.
Nice.
So my final point is simply this. If Freemasonry is a system of morality, we should know how that system contrasts with others. And that means studying other systems, studying other formal systems of morality and ethics. And I think that that's a legitimate topic for Masonic education. And there's several books published on trolley problems, some of which are very pop culturally and easily accessible. and would make an excellent resource for a really lively lodge discussion. And I think that if you have somebody in your lodge who's talented at playing the devil's advocate, at taking the other side, and pushing people to think through these problems, it could produce a really interesting Masonic education and give guys experience in solving moral dilemmas so that when they go out into the world, they do a better job of it. Everything in life is practice. And I don't see why thinking about ethics should be any different than the rest of it.
Mm.
We are born with a moral intuition, which I would argue is implanted in us by God.
Oh, that's
and that we should absolutely consult. But that moral intuition can be informed and sharpened and improved by study, by contemplation, and I would argue by prayer.
And on
I
that
would point to the lecture in the second degree as an example of Freemasonry saying something very like that, but in, of course, veiled language. So that's the presentation. That's what I wanted to teach you today, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Are you sure?
Yes, thank you for that presentation. And anybody who's listening, we would love your feedback. Join us on Facebook, on the IRC, on Reddit. We want to know what you think. And if you have any debates, David would love to debate you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, more than that, I'd like to learn why you think differently, because I think that that's something that's way more interesting sometimes, especially in these kinds of fields, than arguing. Is I really want to learn why the other person thinks differently.
Agreed. Awesome. Well, that's all we have. The fantastic photography on our website is courtesy of Brother Aaron Sherman. Our theme song is composed by Worshipful Christopher Duggan. Our website is maintained, curated, and lovingly tendered by myself. We are grateful for our Patreon sponsors, Jacob Salvik, Uriah Edwards, Arthur we gotta learn this guy's name.
Can we just ask him to send us the pronunciation?
I emailed him so many times. Never returned. He's not on Facebook. I have no idea how he even found us. Brother, thank you for your monthly donation to us. We really appreciate it. Please tell us how to say your name. We also have Patrick Harvey and we have Christopher Patty. To become a Patreon sponsor, visit our website at 3distinctknocks.org, where you will find additional episodes and other content. Essential canine supervision from this episode was provided by Zach and Falula. The opinions expressed in this podcast and on our website are those of the individual contributors and do not represent the opinions of any lodge, Grand Lodge, or other Masonic body. I'm Nicholas Harvey, and I'm incredibly thankful for the brothers that have made this podcast in my Masonic journey so rich, interesting, challenging, and fulfilling. I hope 3 Distinct Knocks has helped you make some daily progress in Freemasonry. Thank you for listening.